I'm back with Sohrab Ahmari, the author of an important book, The Unbroken Thread, which talks about the importance of tradition, a kind of deeper understanding of liberty than we often hear in America. Sohrab, you have a very interesting analysis here of the notion of Gnosticism. Gnosticism is sort of this idea that there's secret knowledge available to certain people, but it's also the idea that the mind is noble and the body, the physical body, the biological body is somehow corrupt and ignoble and degraded. And I was familiar with Gnosticism as a sort of early Christian and post-Christian tradition, but you apply it remarkably to this modern phenomenon of transgenderism, where people basically say, I am what I say I am. So in other words, even if I am biologically a man, I can look down at myself and see that I have all the male characteristics, but I can sort of declare myself a woman, as if to say that my physical body didn't even matter. It has no say over me. And it's a triumph, I guess one could call it, of psychology over biology. Say a word about how we've reached this ridiculous point where we seem to reject even the obvious visible imperatives of nature.
Yeah, I mean, the deformed idea of freedom, which says that freedom is something that is opposed to the restrictions that we get from either nature or tradition, that the more I reject those two things, nature and tradition, the freer I am and I get to define myself, reaches its kind of apotheosis, its absolute logical end in the transgender phenomenon. And as you said, I think there's a clear echo of the ancient Gnostic heresies, which insisted that the human being is, what is truest about us is a kind of divine spark that happens to be trapped in this fleshly apparatus of the body. And so the Gnostics all had a great disdain for bodies, embodiment, nature. They just treated it all as filthy and horrible. And in a strange way, this Gnostic idea has found a stubborn new expression in modern accounts of gender, where I am, as you said, I am not the body I receive from nature, contrary to what Genesis and genetics tell us. I can will myself into being something else, or that there's a kind of trapped interior me that is at odds with my body. And so it's a very old heresy, and it's a very old temptation.
You make a point about tradition and how even though tradition can impose limits, and you use the example, for example, of the Sabbath, the idea that by law, let's say, for example, bars have to be closed on Sunday. And you say this seems like a restriction, an offense against kind of modern liberalism. Why should I be deprived of my right, for example, to buy alcohol on Sunday? But talk about how a Sabbatharian law like this creates a new type of freedom, so that limits and freedom are not opposites, but limits sometimes allow you to experience freedom in a new and maybe more profound way.
Yeah, so the Sabbath, and this nation has had a Sabbatarian tradition, the idea that the law should uphold one day a week as a day of rest and being with God, has had it before there was a republic. I mean, in other words, the colonies all had these restrictions. And the restrictions only went away over the course of the 20th century with the last blue law being abolished in 2019 in North Dakota, statewide blue law. And it was sold, as these things often are, as a triumph of choice. You know, I don't have to do one thing on Sunday. You can shop, you can socialize, you can work. In practice, though, we see that the loss of the Sabbath has actually left us more harried, I argue, has left especially working class people at the mercy of what's called algorithmic human resources scheduling, where they, there's no kind of regularity in how much and when they can spend time with their children. Some days it's on Sunday, some days it's Saturday night, and there's kind of no rest to life. So it's really been liberty for Jeff Bezos. It's been liberty for the Amazon warehouse manager. It's not been liberty for the family and for the worker.
Sohrab, how do we get back on track here? It seems like the country has succumbed. I mean, right now, it's not just that we're fighting the classical liberalism that essentially, you may say, genuflects at the altar of liberty, we're fighting against this woke liberalism that has its own puritanism built into it, if I might say so. It's coercive. It has its own vocabulary of good and evil. It imposes ancestral guilt. Every white person needs to feel like an oppressor and so on. I mean, do we need something on the order of a religious revival or a third great awakening? Virtue and tradition are wonderful, but you can't go to someone and say, you need tradition. But you can go to someone and say, you need Christ. So is it the case that the mechanism for restoring virtue is really religious conversion and religious reawakening, and that short of a third great awakening, it's going to be very difficult to do the things that you beautifully and movingly advocate in your book?
Well, I agree with you that basically evangelizing the culture and exhorting people to virtue and telling them about Christ is very important. But I think that this work that we're talking about does have a political dimension. That is, we have to be willing, conservatives, traditionalists, Christians, and others have to be willing to use power, because as Aristotle says, mere exhortations to virtue aren't enough if there's no kind of formative work that the law and politics and society are doing. And so in a lot of these cases right now, with the woke that you're talking about, it doesn't just mean saying, well, woke ideas are bad, which they're so moronic that you and I can obviously see that, but it means curbing the power of these private tyrannies, these corporations right now that are imposing that. And that's political work. That's not merely exhortation to virtue. If we can't even propose the idea of Christ because we'll get banned on Twitter, then we can't really begin to even exhort people to virtue. So we have to limit the power of, I see as the greatest threats to, even the classic American liberties. Right now, the greatest threat comes from these agglomerations of corporate power in the likes of Twitter and Facebook, which would, if they could get away with it, they would ban both of us, Dinesh, tomorrow. And they may yet, who knows? But so there is an element of dealing with a kind of political and material substrate of society before we can even get to doing the kind of work of exhortation that you're talking about.
Sohrab, this has been very eye-opening and illuminating. Thank you for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.